Ipomoea by John Rackham is a book that I picked up because I recently read and reviewed and enjoyed The Anything Tree by Rackham, and I thought that maybe if I pulled on this thread I would find a relatively forgotten author that could potentially become one of my favourites. And this one follows a sociology professor on Earth, which is now in this future where travel around the globe is almost instantaneous, and so a lot of these lectures are delivered online, which I thought was very forward-thinking when you consider how education is delivered in many parts of the world today. And his father is an extremely successful business mogul who is establishing a human colony on a distant world and making lots of money doing it. And so the two have very different interests and pursuits, with one in this really high level business position and the other one in academia. And even though the two are very different, they do share a mutual respect for each other. And so one day this sociology professor receives a message from his father on this distant planet asking him for help, which is incredibly unusual for him to reach out and ask him this, particularly when the message is fairly sparse and cryptic and mysterious. And so he decides to drop everything that he's doing, take a sabbatical from his university duties, and go on this interstellar voyage to this distant world. And along the way, he is subjected to a series of accidents which look suspiciously like attempts on his life. And he's also picked up by this intergalactic intelligence agency who are investigating this drug that is spreading throughout humanity and ravaging many populations, which is a substance derived from an alien plant which is similar to Morning Glory on Earth. And I think that Ipomoea is the scientific name for that plant. And this substance is highly addictive, and it essentially turns its users into these catatonic, docile, zombie-like entities who essentially just stop communicating. They have no drive or desire to work or contribute. But interestingly, the other effect of this drug is that it makes the user seemingly biologically immortal. These addicts do not die, they do not succumb to disease, they don't need to eat or sleep or drink. And so this intelligence agency are investigating the source of this drug, which they believe is the planet that this man's father is living and operating on. And so you get this really three-pronged question going into the narrative here. One is, why is his father sending him this distress call seemingly out of the blue? Why have there been these attempts on his life? And what is going on with this drug? Which is a fairly entertaining setup, but this book basically descends into what is effectively a kind of pulpy mystery thriller, and in the end it just didn't really leave much of a mark on me, which was disappointing considering how much I like The Anything Tree. There was another element in here where there's a female character who basically just throws herself at anyone who looks in her general direction, and she is basically just there to be an object of lust for these other characters. And again, I didn't really expect this from Rackham, so I leave this one feeling quite disappointed. But it's not terrible, it's just okay. And I'm glad to have this Dobson hardcover in my collection because I do think it is quite aesthetically pleasing. But I'm frustrated with myself in some way because I'm reading through Science Fiction, the 100 Best Novels list by David Pringle, which I'm about halfway through at this point, and I'm on this main road with this list, making good progress, but I find myself becoming distracted by these bizarre sort of roadside attractions, and I find myself veering off into these side roads, which sometimes end up being dead ends and not really offering me anything particularly fulfilling. But I am back on that main road now, and I am going to keep on trucking because the next 3 books that I read are all part of that Pringle list. So again, I'm making decent progress with that. And the first book that I picked up following Ipomoea is The Crystal World by J.G. Ballard. And I've read J.G. Ballard before with The Drowned World, which is part of this kind of catastrophe trilogy with The Drowned World, The Crystal World, and The Burned World, I think. And really going from John Rackham to J.G. Ballard was night and day in terms of the writing. I think that J.G. Ballard is one of the best writers that I've encountered on this science fiction reading journey. I think he's probably one of the best prose stylists in the genre, full stop. And this one follows a doctor who is treating lepers when he loses communication with a former colleague and that colleague's wife, who he was having an affair with behind that colleague and friend's back. And so he decides to drop everything and seek them out where they are posted in the deep jungles of Cameroon in Central Africa. And so he tells himself that he is tracking down his former colleague, but really he has this obsession with this woman, and he seems to be consciously aware of that, even though he's kind of telling himself that that's not the reason that he's going on this journey. But he sets out on this expedition, and there are a number of intriguing characters heading into the jungle with him, including a priest who is a kind of Christian missionary, and then a mysterious physicist, I think he is, called Ventris. And these 3 men all kind of have their own agendas within the jungle, and alongside them there is a young female journalist who, somewhat predictably, the main character falls into a romantic relationship with fairly early on. When he turns up at the port on the outskirts of this jungle, he discovers that the military have kind of cordoned off a fairly sizable zone within the jungle, because it turns out that there is this mysterious spreading affliction originating there, which is crystallizing everything within a certain area, where the trees, the animals, and the water and the soil are all hardening into these crystalline structures where they are encrusted in these diamond or gemstone-like constructions that are having a strange effect on the light in this area. So during the daytime, this jungle is weirdly dark and muted, whereas at nighttime, these crystalline structures seem to emit light in this really otherworldly, glittering way, where it seems like during the day, these crystals are absorbing the daylight and then distributing it out at night. So reality already is kind of flipped on its head, and I think that that is probably the best part of the Crystal World. This really atmospheric sense of place that is deeply strange and, as I said, otherworldly. I didn't really expect there to be as much action in the Crystal World as there is, and while I think that J.G. Ballard describes all of that action fairly well, it does get a little bit repetitive. And speaking of repetitive, I think that another amazing part of the book is Ballard's description of these crystalline landscapes and the physical and mental toll that it is exerting on the characters inside it. But there are only so many ways that Ballard finds to describe these encrusted trees or animals or landscapes, and I think that he does run out of room with that by the end of the novel, where certain turns of phrase, certain words and descriptions are popping up time and time again. But it's not a particularly long novel, so I don't think that it ever really presents much of an issue. But I do think that overall I did prefer The Drowned World from my Ballard reading so far. That being said though, I think that if you're looking for something that falls into that kind of tradition of zone-based science fiction with some really atmospheric world building and some incredible prose, you can't really go wrong with The Crystal World. The next book that I read was Venus Plus X by Theodore Sturgeon, with this really 70s cover on the edition that I've got there that I'm not particularly fond of, to be honest, but there we go, it's an interesting one. And this follows a man who wakes up in a cell at the top of a bizarre conical tower which is overlooking this grassy meadow encased in an enormous dome, which is something that comes up time and time again in science fiction. And he encounters these strange individuals who refer to themselves as the Ladom, that are vaguely androgynous and bizarre looking, and wearing these ornate outfits with capes and gowns and unusual accessories. And he begins to communicate with them, formulating 3 key questions. One being, where is he? The second one being, how did he get there? And the third one being, why him? Alongside this main plotline, there are these interstitial chapters which feature a family in what I believe is 1950s America who are having some radical, unconventional ideas about how they want to raise their children. I don't really want to get into spoilers for the narrative here because this is only about 150 pages or so. It's a quick and easy read, but it is essentially Theodore Sturgeon exploring gender and the roles of men and women in society and speculating on human evolution in line with shifts in ideological thinking. So those interstitial chapters that I mentioned don't really make sense initially in terms of how they tie into the central plot line, but in the end you do see what Sturgeon is doing, and I do think that it is effective without being heavy-handed or didactic in any way. I think that if I was going to criticise this book for anything, I think that it would be a prolonged section towards the end of the book where Sturgeon basically just lays all of his cards out on the table for you and tells you directly what he's doing in this really explanatory way that I don't feel was completely necessary. I do think you understand the themes and the ideas and the concepts long before Sturgeon explains them directly to you. I think that that probably could have been omitted. But outside of that, I do think that it's a compelling and entertaining read with a particularly good ending that I didn't really see coming, if I'm completely honest. Throughout the whole thing, you are wondering along with this main character on those 3 questions that I mentioned, and you're coming up with ideas and theories about what might actually be going on. And I didn't ever quite come to the conclusion of the actual reveal. So that was a satisfying experience to have that land from a completely unexpected place. I've read Theodore Sturgeon in the past with More Than Human, which I really liked as well, and I would be keen to read some more of his work. I don't think there are any of his other books in this list that I'm reading through, but it might be a worthwhile diversion at some point from that main road. And the last book that I read in this little batch is The Long Tomorrow by Leigh Brackett. And the obligatory mention with Leigh Brackett is that she wrote one of the early drafts of The Empire Strikes Back, I think, or at least worked on it alongside George Lucas and co. And this one is a post-apocalyptic story where the world has been ravaged by nuclear war and all of the cities have been destroyed and all of the associated technology. And so the people that have flourished in this new world are a number of religious groups such as the Mennonites and the Amish, because they already reject the idea of cities and technology and industry, opting to handcraft goods and live by the land. And so because they have been adopting this lifestyle for many generations already, this nuclear war that wiped out all of these cities and this technology doesn't really impact them in any meaningful way outside of bolstering their religious beliefs, since they see them to be vindicated by this great catastrophe. And outside of these groups, there are also some splitter factions that have developed unique and warped ideas from the likes of the Mennonites and the Amish. We're following a young boy called Len and his cousin Esau, who have this curiosity about the world that came before and about cities and about technology. And they are fascinated by rumours of the last city in existence, which is referred to as Barterstown, and the notion that some of the traders that passed through these various remaining towns and communities are actually from Barterstown secretly. And because of this great rejection of all of those ideas, if somebody is suspected of being from Barterstown, they are met with an extremely hostile and, in one case fairly early on in the book, fatal response. This sense of forbidden knowledge is something that seeps into the mind of these two boys, and that is really elevated when the two of them steal a radio from one of those traders. And this is a piece of technology the likes of which they've never seen or heard about, and they become fascinated with it to the point that they get it to work and they hear communications coming through the radio, which ignites this fire in them that they are going to leave their town, which is called Piper's Run, and go out across this wasteland in search of Barterstown. So that's really the framing for this novel, which essentially is a kind of epic journey across the American wilderness, where the two boys are encountering different religious groups, different societal models and ideas about some of the religious doctrine that has been so heavily instilled within them. This one is really highly regarded, and I can definitely see why, but I don't think that after I set this one down I felt like it really hit me with the gut punch that I was expecting while I was reading through it. That being said, I do think that it is incredibly well written, and I can see why so many people love this one in the way that they do. I think it would probably be a great book to recommend to people who reject science fiction as a genre and are not into some of the more out there concepts that you see within it. And it's potentially a good bridge between people who read more traditional literary fiction and science fiction, because I do think that Brackett infuses it with that kind of merit and gravity in terms of the narrative and the characters. If you're interested in post-apocalyptic fiction, this one kind of feels essential to me, and even though I'm not completely taken with it, I did find it to be a really enjoyable reading experience, and I would definitely be interested in reading some more Brackett. So they are the 4 books that I finished recently. One was a bit of a disappointing distraction, but the others I think are worth your time, and all 3 of those are present on Science Fiction, the 100 Best Novels list by David Pringle. If you are interested in following along on my journey through this list, like I say, I am about halfway and I'm really accelerating my reading through it, then feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, because there will be more reviews, there will be more book hauls, and there will be more lists coming up on the channel. I think by the time that this video goes live, I will be around the 1,500 subscriber mark, so I just want to say thank you very much for subscribing. Like I've mentioned before, a lot of my viewers, according to my analytics, aren't subscribed, and I feel like as a creator you naturally hit some of these plateaus as your channel is growing. And so the fact that you have gone out of your way to click on that subscribe button is something that I am extremely grateful for. So thank you very much. Have you read any of these books that I talked about today? If you haven't, do they sound intriguing to you? Or do you disagree with any of my takes? Let me know your thoughts and I will catch you on the next one.